Teachers like Father Paul or Padre and Dr. Ed, they don't come down the pike very often. They were very unusual human beings, and we were blessed to have such caliber of men walking among us. They made society's playing field a little more level. They championed causes, and they taught us self-pride and to love one another. They taught many examples. We should celebrate them any time we see fit. We should not forget them. We should play them over and over in our minds and in our hearts, just like you see television commercials played over and over, or you hear the radio and you see or hear a certain commercial played over and over. That's the way that we should replay all of the things these wonderful human beings that walked among us did, lest we forget and become lazy and waste some of their time and great effort that they put forth to show us the way. They were outstanding individuals, both of them. Here to speak more about Dr. Ed is Michael Coard, Esquire. He drew national attention to an early historical entity called the Philadelphia White House and the fact that America's first president had slaves, which maybe some of us didn't know. Mr. Coard is an attorney, radio personality, and one who refuses to push the easy button when the situation tells him to do otherwise. So if Mr. Michael Coard is among us, would he please come forward?
Well, first of all, I'm actually honored to hear my name come out of the mouth of Bob Perkins. I can leave now because that's just a powerful thing. I had my speech all ready to go and I was ready to flow, and now I'm completely discombobulated because Mr. Bob Perkins said my name. Let me compose myself and just spend a couple of minutes talking about the great, and I do mean the great, Dr. Edward Robinson. But first of all, I want to greet his lovely wife, Harriette Robinson, and his children. They certainly are going to carry on the tradition. And when I say a few minutes, I do mean just a few minutes, because I know many folks have some important words to share, and I don't want to take up too much time. In addition, after I leave here, I have to run to 6th and Market. There are a few organizations that have decided to come to Philadelphia to have their conventions, and a few of them are going to travel throughout Center City. And one of the sites they're going to is 6th and Market. And they found out about ATTACK, about Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, about the Slavery Memorial. So they asked me to come down and do a tour. And I've been doing these tours for a while, but one day, Dr. Robinson said to me, Mike, you know, this stuff you're doing about avenging the ancestors and highlighting the issue of slavery, this is important work. But you know, the clock doesn't begin at noon. And I said, I'm not sure what that means. It's kind of cryptic. What do you mean the clock doesn't begin at noon? He said the clock begins at midnight. Now what you're doing is you're talking about some important stuff that happened at noontime, and noontime is slavery. But if you look at a clock, the day begins not at noon, but it begins at midnight. And he asked me, well, what happened at midnight? What happened in the beginning? Were black folks born in a country called slavery as slaves and a continent called slavery? I'm like, well, obviously not. He said, well, where'd they come from? And I felt like, I'm like, why are you grilling me? You know, I went to law school, I went to college. Why are you asking me all these questions? But he really wasn't asking me questions. He was telling me stuff. And what he was telling me is that it's important to talk about Harriet Tubman and Gabriel Prosser and Nat Turner and Frederick Douglass and all these great black men and women who did great stuff. He said, but if you look at every other ethnic group, they never highlight their defeats. They always highlight their victories. And I began to think about that. He said, as horrific and as tragic as slavery was, and you should talk about it, you have to let black little boys and black little girls that their history is not all about slavery, that something happened before noontime, something happened at midnight. And what happened at midnight happened 200,000 years ago in the Nile Valley of East Africa. Not just the first African then, but the first human being, the first Homo sapien on the planet in the Nile Valley region of East Africa. So when you talk about the issue of slavery, talk about that, but talk about it secondarily. So today, now when these people hear me at 6th and Market in about a half an hour, they're going to think I'm this great scholar and this great genius, but I'm a plagiarizer, because I'm going to plagiarize everything that Dr. Ed Robinson told me. I'm going to talk about the slavery stuff, and I'm going to say to them, did you know that the clock didn't begin at noon? The clock actually began at midnight. And then talk about the importance. Again, Dr. Robinson did not mean to diminish the importance of slavery. He said that the story of slavery should be told. But every time you talk about slavery as a defeat, talk about ancient Africa as a victory. And a lot of people don't know this, but Dr. Robinson, in connection with, by the way, I had a speech all prepared, but I'm not reading any of it, and that's Mr. Bob Perkins' fault, because he got me discombobulated, so I'm somewhere else now. I mean, I had all of this fancy stuff to talk about, but I'm not even talking about this anymore. So when I talk about the issue of slavery, I always have to incorporate the issue of ancient Africa, because that's the beginning, and people need to understand that. And that's what Dr. Robinson always talked about. When I say always, I mean not always throughout his adult life, but always even in connection with the 6th and Market project. As great as that project is at 6th and Market, this President's House, this slave memorial, many people don't know that Dr. Robinson was on one of the teams that was competing to design the project. And Dr. Robinson's team was not selected, not because they weren't good enough, but because they were too black. That's the truth. Dr. Robinson wanted to include at 6th and Market, in addition to slavery, some important stuff about West Africa, about Timbuktu, about all of the greatness of Africans, because he wanted little black boys and little black girls and white boys and white girls to see this slavery stuff, but to understand we didn't come from that. We came from something bigger and better. And because Dr. Robinson, anybody who knows him knows that he just won't take no for an answer. I mean, this man is so principled and unwilling to compromise. Dr. Robinson could have whitened up his story, his version, his part of the project, and maybe his team would have won, and you would have seen Dr. Robinson's project at 6th and Market. But he wasn't willing to whiten it up. He wanted the story of black folks to be told front and center. And if it wasn't going to be told front and center, then he said, pass it on to somebody else. And that's the only reason why we don't know what we should know about the history of pre-colonial Africa. When I say pre-colonial Africa, people need to understand that, as I said, 200,000 years ago, Nile Valley region of East Africa, black folks were doing their thing, and doing their thing without interruption. In fact, even later on, well after that, from the 9th century to the 16th century, that was basically the pinnacle, the apex of intellectual achievement in Africa. When you talk about not just Timbuktu, not just the University of Sankore, but when you talk about the Songhai Empire, that's what Dr. Robinson always talked about. And it's really funny because I was fortunate enough to go to one of the greatest schools in the country, Masterman. And when we would go on field trips and class trips, like any other school students would go, I noticed that we would go down to, back then it was at 5th and Market, not 6th, but we would all go to 5th and Market, see the Liberty Bell, and the little white boys and the little white girls were not just happy, but ecstatic about hearing about George Washington and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and they should have been. But the little black boys like me and the little black girls, for us it was just a day off from school. We had no idea why the white kids were celebrating. Now think about this. If we had known then what we know now, we would have been insisting upon going down to Liberty Bell Center every day, not only just to hear the story about how these 9 black men, women, and children were enslaved by George Washington at America's first White House, how George Washington plucked these 9 from the 316 he enslaved in Mount Vernon, Virginia. If we had known then what we know now, we would have been able to talk about that. And then, if somebody like Dr. Robinson would have been able to slip some of that Afrocentric history stuff into the story of slavery, now these little black boys and little black girls would have done better in school. I certainly would have. Prime example. Even though I love to write, and writing is one of my strongest suits, math for me is horrible. Whether it's addition, subtraction, I'm just horrible with that. And one of the reasons why I'm horrible with that is because I was intimidated by numbers. It just seems so complicated to me. And then when I talked to Dr. Robinson, he told me about calculus and algebra and geometry coming out of Africa. I'm thinking all of these special types of mathematical equations and concepts came out of Europe, and it's foreign to me. Also, I'm taught in school as a kid that Africans were not literate. They didn't read and they didn't write. And then I'm finding out from Dr. Robinson, not only did they read and did they write, but the Europeans stole what they read and what they wrote. And I'm beginning to get all of this stuff, and you know, people, the best analogy I can give is Muhammad Ali. People called Muhammad Ali arrogant. But for me, it's not arrogance if you can back it up. If you say you're the greatest, and if you say you're going to knock out somebody in the 6th round, and you do that, then you are the greatest. Now, if these little black boys and these little black girls found out about people whose hair was like theirs, whose skin was like theirs, whose nose was like theirs, came up with algebra and geometry and calculus, they would say, well, if my father and my grandfather, my great-grandfather can do it, then so can I. And they would have done better. And I'll wrap it up by saying this. I have a petition here that I'm going to leave, and I'm going to ask that it be circulated, and I can get it from Kima or anybody else. But this petition is about Dr. Ed Robinson's infusion project. And I heard about this infusion project a few years ago, and what I thought it meant was a kind of Black history thing. You know how every February we talk about Dr. King and Rosa Parks, and then we move on. But when Dr. Robinson talks about infusion, he's not talking about making Afrocentric history a component of education. He's talking about incorporating into it and making it part of the same thing. And when we talk about infusion, what he means is this. It's not as if we talk about some Black history stuff periodically. And by the way, I need to be clear when I mention infusion. The School District of Philadelphia has its own official curriculum where they have stuff that they're required to teach children. And Dr. Robinson came up with this incredibly ingenious idea. And this idea is to include in that official curriculum this stuff I just shared with you about calculus, about geometry, about algebra, about 200,000 years ago, about Timbuktu, about all of this, about the Songhai Empire. But he said, Mike, don't make it a Black History Month moment. Infuse it so that when children are taught about reading and writing and arithmetic, it all goes back to Africa. Everything you talk about reading and literacy and the written document and papyrus and paper, that goes back to Africa. When you talk about writing, that goes back to Africa. When you talk about arithmetic, that goes back. So you talk about infusion. And the best way I can describe it is this. Down at 6th and Market, where we deal with the issue of slavery in the President's House, that has been infused into the history of George Washington. Because before then, you talk about George Washington as this great patriot, as this great general, as this great president. And then maybe now and then off to the side, you'll throw in the story about slavery parenthetically. But now, based on what Attack has been able to do, the story of slavery and George Washington has been infused. So when you talk about one, you have to talk about the other. And what Dr. Edward Robinson came up with was to infuse. And he didn't necessarily call it Afrocentric history, he called it world history. Because it's not as if it's important necessarily because it came out of Africa. It's important because it's the original, it's the first, and it's from people like us. So what Attack has been doing is this. Dr. Robinson is the brains who came up with this infusion project. Attack, ATAC, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, we're the brawn, the muscle, to push forward Dr. Robinson's plan for infusion. And this is not something that just happened. Dr. Robinson came up with this back in 1971 with local scholars, including a world-renowned scholar, Dr. John Henrik Clark. Can you imagine Dr. John Henrik Clark and Dr. Ed Robinson coming together in 1971 and putting this project together? That's 1971. And it was approved by the school district. Then again, a second time in 2004, it was approved by the school superintendent. So all the stuff has been done. The brain work has been done. We need the muscle now. So again, I'm going to pass this around and ask folks to sign this petition, and we hope to get 5,000 to 10,000 signatures and bombard the School Reform Commission with a demand that they finally infuse Dr. Ed Robinson's program. I was going to go through my speech, but again,
And I want to dedicate this Humanity Award to Dr. Ed Robinson, and I present the Weekend of Peace Committee Award 2012 to Dr. Ed Robinson, historian, author, filmmaker, author of the African Culture of Science, which established in fact that Africans create all the mathematics, science, civil, and religious systems which govern our civilization today. And it is poignant for us to present this to Dr. Ed Robinson because of history. A history that we should not we should not never forget and always live by. And I want to present this to the family. Who is the presentee?
Harriette Robinson. Harriette Robinson's wife.
And I'd like to give this to the wife.
We have another award for Dr. Robinson. You know, I met Dr. Robinson in probably 1966 or 67. And, you know, he changed my life. He changed who I was. Dr. Robinson made everybody feel good about themselves.
But it was about him liberating his people, and the fact that his main concern is, what can we do so that our people are not suffering all of the ills and all of the things disproportionately to everybody. So with all your smiles on your faces and your rejoicing with me for the Good Shepherd who has fed his sheep. God bless all of you.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. I guess we want to take some pictures.